wondered what happened to you, Kay. My wife just disappeared. Back on the back. All right, good to see everybody here this morning.
Good morning. Amen.
I want to, continue this series on imitating Jesus. Eli talking about I've decided to follow Jesus. In deciding to follow Jesus, one of the things we decide to do is to imitate his life. And today I want us to look at, I think, one of the most beautiful parts of Jesus' life. And it's something that as you look at it, if you're like me, you realize I still have a ways to go to be what he is. But I want to get there. I want to move toward what he is. Let me begin with a passage in Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 through 38. It says, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. This passage says that Jesus, when he saw these crowds, he had compassion on them. This word compassion means a deep awareness of the suffering of another person. Being able to put yourself in their shoes, moved by their suffering or condition, coupled with the desire to do something about it if you can. And that was how Jesus felt about people and issues. Eli was talking about how many of us have faced challenges in life. Was there anybody here that didn't raise their hand? We all face challenges in life. And we're just glad somebody has compassion when we're going through some of those things. And just think about it for just a moment. If our God and his Son had not had compassion on us, we would be without God and without hope. We'd be like Rover. We'd be dead all over. And there's nothing, there's no redeeming. There would be no redeeming. There would be nothing. Because he had compassion on us. I want to read, and you're not going to be able to, probably not going to be able to put it up on the screen fast enough, but I want to read a few of the passages where it describes the compassion of Jesus. Mark 8:2. I have compassion for these people because they've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they'll collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. Here, just a simple thing here. I don't really concern myself with whether you're hungry or not. But Jesus had these crowds that were following him. He was sensitive to that. I don't know that anybody else was sensitive to that. But he had compassion on them. In Mark chapter 1, verse 41, it says, a man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, if you're willing, make me clean. Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. He said, I'm willing, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him and he was cured. Matthew 20, verse 34. Jesus stopped and called them. Two blind men. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. Lord, they answered, we want our sight. And Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes, and immediately they received their sight and followed him. Luke 7:13. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. It's the word compassion there. And he said, don't cry. And he went up and touched the coffin, and it stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, get up from the dead. And the boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Those are just a few of the passages where it uses the word compassion. But think about some of the examples of Jesus' compassion. The woman caught in adultery. Jesus had compassion for her. The woman at the well that had been married 5 times and now was living with somebody, Jesus had compassion for her. The thief on the cross, Jesus was filled with compassion. There's even a compassion for the Pharisees. In Matthew chapter 23, one of the most scathing rebukes that Jesus ever gave was with the Pharisees. And yet that chapter ends with these words. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I've longed to gather together your children, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But you were not willing to look, and your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And then in Luke 23, verse 34, Jesus is dying on the cross, put to death an innocent man, railroaded to the cross, and he says, "Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Jesus wasn't just occasionally compassionate. I think that's part of who Jesus was. I think that was part of his personality. I think when Jesus saw somebody, I think he was moved by whatever he saw in that person. I think he just had that compassion, that constant compassion. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12, also in Ephesians 4:32, 1 Peter 3:8, and other passages, here's a direction given to us as Christians. "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion and kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience." Of all the people in the world, the most compassionate people ought to be those of us who follow Christ. Because that's who he was. And that's who we're called to be. You know, there's some great examples of compassion in this congregation. Gerald and Jocelyn feed the hungry once a month here in Claremont, I guess. Mascot, yeah. They're in the church program for that. That's their heart. That's compassion. Reggie and Martine go back to Haiti to help run a school to see that some of the children can be educated, get medical help for people. That's compassion. Mike and Debbie take their niece and nephew in every summer to take care of them and provide the dental work and the medical work and so forth before they go back to school. That's compassion. Angie, the other day, she had a co-worker that her mother died. And as you can imagine, she was distraught and she went home. After working all day, Angie went over to her house just to spend time with her, take her out, and comfort her and encourage her. That's compassion. Andrea and others who take food into families that need help. Joe and Dora Lynn taking a family into their home until they can get settled. That's compassion. Those of you who help our teens and helping them to become the men and women God wants them to be. The Oteros, the Lamberts, the Camarinos, the Nortons. Those of you that study and counsel with people. Many other acts of compassion. And I'm sure I've missed some and other acts of compassion. That's the way God's people should be. And that's what our hearts should be filled with, is compassion. What gets in the way of our compassion? How many of you have ever been shopping at Walmart on Saturday at 10 o'clock? Yeah, you know the pain. I'd rather have a root canal. But I've been there, and you walk in. First of all, I don't know all the Walmarts are like this, but this one down our way is, the entrance is on the left, and the exit is on the right. It's usually the other way around. So people are walking in both ways. And the first aggravation is trying to get into the entrance. And then you get in, and sometimes once or twice I've gone by myself because Kay came up with some kind of excuse. And, you start down those aisles, and then in our part of the area, people from other countries have come over here to visit, and so of course, their children are with them, and so you've got whole families clogging the aisle. Yeah. And it's hard to get through, and you're banging in. And then there's these little old ladies. They do not know the right-of-way and the rules of Walmart. And they come charging out of those side aisles, and they'll bump into your cart, and you just get out of their way. unless you want to be lying flat on your back. But you go through, people are just aggravating and rude, and the workers are out in the middle of the aisle, and they're stocking, and they're yelling back and forth to each other. And finally you get up to the checkout stand, and they don't have enough checkers, and you're standing in a long line, and inevitably you got people that have got their carts filled to the full. Or you try to go through, if you have 20 items or less, you try to go through the 20 items or less, and there's somebody who's divided their order into 20 items or less, and they're going to check out one of those at a time, and then they're arguing over a coupon. And then you go outside and you can't remember where you parked your car. I thought, as I was doing this lesson, I was thinking, it's easy to go through life not seeing people.
Yeah.
I go to Walmart, I don't see people, I see a mission. Let's get this done. I think sometimes we just have to slow down enough to see people. After I started doing this lesson, I was going up someplace to shop. And I saw a guy coming across the parking lot, and he had an involuntary movement of his hand, and he was walking in kind of a strange gait. And I know that man has a chronic disease that he'll have the rest of his life. And I don't know that I'd always notice that, but I started thinking, how would Jesus have seen what I see every day, what you see every day? What would he feel? What would he do? What would he say? And then a lot of times Jesus' teaching is against the backdrop of a culture and a time when people didn't have compassion. You remember the parable of the publican and the Pharisee? And the Pharisee is praying. The publican's over there. He won't even lift his eyes up to heaven. He knows he's messed up royally before God. And the Pharisee's got his eyes up to God, and he's saying, I'm just glad I'm not like this guy. I fast every day. I give a tenth and blah, 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 blah. Isn't that so human? And just a lack of compassion. Instead of looking at people with compassion, it's easy to look at people with disdain. Sometimes we may, what gets in the way of compassion is we feel like people don't deserve compassion.
Yep.
They messed up. They made a decision and they messed up. Everybody deserves compassion. Sometimes it's hard when we get hurt to be compassionate toward people. If I took a show of hands, if you've been a disciple for very long, you've been hurt by somebody. In the church. I remember in Boston, when I was serving in the eldership there were 7 of us, and we fired a preacher that was well liked by a lot of people. And I remember 2 brothers opposed that. They thought they were they didn't know what we knew as an eldership, and we weren't going to tell them all the things that we knew, but instead of them saying, here are 7 spiritual men who have made a decision, they must have a reason for making it, they were up in arms about it. It took me weeks to forgive those guys. It took me a long time that I didn't think bad thoughts about them and want to just get them told. And maybe you've had that kind of experience too. That's hard. But you know what? We have to have compassion. And sometimes we can feel compassion but don't do anything about it. C.S. Lewis, who is a Christian writer, said this. He says, it's easier to be enthusiastic about humanity with a capital H than it is to love individual men and women, especially those who are uninteresting, exasperating, depraved, or otherwise unattractive. Wow. Loving everybody in general may be an excuse for loving nobody in particular.
Wow.
That's a lot. Compassion can be a theoretical thing if we're not careful. Jesus had 3 parables that all of them, I think all of us would know these parables immediately, that has to do with compassion. There's a lesson in each one of them. The parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10 and verse 33. I'll just read just a small part of it here. As a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. A man had been injured. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and then put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The guy somebody had asked a question, who is my neighbor? Jesus said, you need to love your neighbor. Who is my neighbor? You know what that is? There's so many people out there. How can you define who is your neighbor? And basically, Jesus said, if you see somebody that needs help, you help them. You do what you can, what's right in front of you. Don't worry, you're not going to change the whole world, but are you compassionate toward the people around you? And this man was, and yet the religious leaders of the day, the thing that bothers me about that, it'd be preachers today, passed by on the other side. They wanted to avoid the issues. And then the one that's very powerful is Matthew chapter 18, verse 26, the unjust servant. And the idea here is that here's a man, Jesus used this parable, he says there's a man that was owed a great deal of money. Anybody ever seen these out in the dirt? You see these inverted little cones in the dirt that there's an ant, we call them in Texas ant lions. And if an ant tumbles into that, he can't get out. He'll try to crawl up the side and the sand just kind of crumbles and he goes back to the ant line and gets him. Sometimes you can get into a hopeless situation. And this guy was in a hopeless situation. He owed more than he could pay in 6 lifetimes. And this master says, I'm going to throw you in prison, and I'm going to take care of your family. I'm going to throw them in prison. I'm going to sell them until that debt is paid. And then the man begged him, please don't do that. Please forgive me. Please let me have time to pay it. And he was so touched by the man that he erased his debt.
Wow.
And it says this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged. I'll pay back everything. And the servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt and let him go. And you remember the rest of the parable, what he did? He went out, somebody that owed him a whole lot less money, and he came down so hard on him. He had no mercy. It was justice when it came to who owed him money. He was going to throw that guy in jail. And then it got back to the master, and the master said, you know what? You owe me money. And what's the reason? What's the purpose of that parable? It is to show us that compassion is something that we're going to need. And if we don't demonstrate it to other people, God may not demonstrate it to us.
That's right.
And so we need to be compassionate toward others because we need compassion. Now there's 2 ways that compassion can get off the path. 2 ways that Jesus shows us the straight path, the path of compassion, but there's 2 ways that you can go. You can become judgmental, and you can just be condemning of people and looking down on people and don't have any use for them. That's one way. And the other side is sentimentalism. And I'll give you an example, and I've used this illustration before, but it's perfect here, so I'll use it again. I had, in Boston, we had a CR ministry, which we've had here as well, chemical recovery, people that were addicted. And there was one of the things you had to do, if somebody had an addiction and they wanted to be a part of the CR ministry, they had to have a sponsor. So this guy asked me if I would sponsor him. I said I would. So I went to the group. And one of the things that the group did is they wrote a journal. And what they were supposed to do in this journal is they were supposed to write down what their addiction had cost them, the ugliness of it. Just pour their soul out on it. And in this particular time, I imagine this happens with our group too, somebody wrote their journal and they kind of soft-pedaled it and they said, go back and rewrite it. You're still not in touch with it. And so this guy had rewritten his journal several times. I was sitting right next to him. And as he read it, he started sobbing. I mean, he just broke down and sobbed. And I reached over and put my arm around him to comfort him. And the guy that was leading the CR group said, Greg, don't put your arm around him. So I took my arm off and I thought to myself, you unloving, stiff-necked Pharisee. This guy's hurting. But he got with me afterwards. He said, Greg, what you did kept him from feeling the weight of his addiction. What you were actually doing was enabling him to continue with his addiction. Now, that wasn't your intention. He said he needed to feel the weight, the consequences of his addiction. He needed that in order to get well. And you know, I think sometimes with good intentions, we drift into sentimentalism when it comes to compassion. Jesus didn't say to the woman caught in adultery, he didn't say, you know what, that's not a big deal. Everybody does that. He forgave her. And he knew that the crowd was just doing this. They didn't care anything about the woman. They weren't doing that to honor God. They were doing it to test Jesus. But he said, go and sin no more. There was a part of his compassion that was directive and helpful. I think sometimes, and you can take this for what it's worth, I think sometimes we can do that with our kids. We don't let them suffer the consequences. We enable them to continue whatever behavior they're into. And we do it with good intentions. We're going to love them, we're going to be by them, and we don't let them get to a place where they can really make the changes they need to make. But we're going to need compassion, but not judgment by itself and not sentimentalism by itself. Compassion is a desire to help, but a real desire to do what will help the person, not just make them feel good or enable them, but to help them get to a different place. And then there's Luke 15, verse 20, the parable of the prodigal son. That's one of the most powerful passages in the Bible. And you can just imagine the story between the lines in here, where this boy, he gets up to a certain age, and he's wanting to get out away from home. He wants to get out and have fun. And so he takes an early inheritance. Can you imagine the conversations he had with his father and brother? His father probably said, son, don't do this. Don't do it. There's going to be plenty of time. And the brother was probably saying, listen, you're going to leave me holding the bag. I'm going to have to do everything. But the boy went ahead and left. And he got to a point, he spent all of his money. He was a Jewish boy feeding pigs. My aunt and uncle lived on a farm. I used to go out in Dallas and visit with them. And out on their back screened-in porch, they had this big earthen pot. And it was called the slop bucket. And all the stuff from the house, food, leftovers, and everything, it went into that slop bucket. That was the foul stuff, let me tell you. And they'd take that out, the hogs loved it. Well, this boy got to the point where he was eating out of the slop bucket. And then he decided, my dad, his servants do better than this. I'm going to go home and tell him, sorry, so he goes. And the interesting thing is, it says that the father's looking, and he sees in the distance, he sees his son and recognizes that's his son. You ever notice that all of us have a little different way of walking, and you can see from a long way, a mother or father can make out their son or daughter in a crowd because they know how they walk, their mannerism. And this father saw this boy coming across the field. And he runs to him and throws his arms around him. And he's full of compassion for that boy. I saw this one time. A woman had disappeared for a number of years and showed up one night, surprised her family. And that family didn't just, well, what did you go away for? They were crying and hugging and just glad to see them again. That was this father. And somebody years ago, Charlie Hodge, had a sermon. He entitled it, Will God Run? And that's what that parable's all about. That man, that father, is God. And that prodigal is us. And God will run. He has compassion. And that's the spirit that we need to have. The older brother And it was hard for him to deal with it because that boy had wronged him, and he wronged his dad, and he couldn't see anything but disdain for his brother. But his dad had a different picture of it and tried to talk to the older boy. Compassion is something our world direly needs. We need it, and the people around us need it.
That's right.
And as Christians, we know how to give it because we know how we got it.
Amen.
If we're in touch with it. Compassion for all kinds of different circumstances. Here's my challenge to you this week. In your solitude, in the quietness, ask yourself, where do I need to be more compassionate? It might be a family member. It might be a relative. It might be someone you work with. Where do I need to have more compassion in my life? Where do I need to grow in my compassion? What part of my life has judgment replaced compassion? Just judgmentalness. And where in my life has sentimentalism replaced true compassion? And really just examine our heart and our life. And then ask yourself this question: how would Jesus have dealt with this situation? How would Jesus want me to deal with this situation? Our Lord was the most compassionate man. Compassionate toward us, continues to be compassionate toward us. And we need to reflect that in our lives as we go about our lives. A right kind of compassion. Not sentimentalism, not judgmentalism, but a real compassion to see the suffering, the hurt, the need in people's lives, and if we can, to be able to do something about it. I'd like to close this lesson with a prayer. Would you pray with me? Father in heaven, there are so many beautiful attributes about your Son, but there's none more beautiful than the compassionate heart that he had. Father, he just had the balance of compassion with all the other things that are needed. Help us to imitate him. Help us to have more and more a heart of compassion for people around us and circumstances around us. And help us have his heart to want to do whatever we can do to help somebody. It's in Jesus' name. Amen.